All right, thanks, Bob. And next up is Joe Martin, Professor Joe Martin from the Rotman School. Among his many accomplishments and achievements, Joe Martin is the Director of the Canadian Business and Financial History Initiative here at Rotman and President Emeritus of Canada's History Society. A management consultant by profession, as I understand it, Joe was in charge of a major firm for many years in Canada. Joe has been teaching at the Rotman School in addition to those responsibilities, presumably at certain points, for the past 21 years. And Joe will be talking to us now about social responsibility, bloodshed at Seven Oaks, and the merger of the Hudson's Bay and the Northwest Companies.
Thank you, Will. The error in the title is I'll also conclude with social responsibility, just as I'll begin with social responsibility. Let me just say a word in the structure of the presentation. This presentation began 10 months ago when Will and I met in London and discussing this conference, not the paper. But as we talked about it, Will and I had not before, I said, well, gee, maybe I could do a paper. And so Will said, on what topic? I said, well, on bloodshed at Seven Oaks. And I love doing that with people from Kent, because people from Kent assume there's only one Seven Oaks, not realizing there's a Seven Oaks in the Canadian prairie. And they've never heard of it, as many things in Canada the Brits haven't heard of, but that was the genesis of the paper. So it's a brief description of Rupert's Land, Lord Selkirk, his land grant and settlement, competition between two companies prior to and subsequent to the massacre of Seven Oaks, which led to the merger of the two companies. But since there's been an enormous amount of material written on the fur trade wars in Canada, I will attempt to analyze the historical events using a practitioner's approach. And before doing that, I want to make a few comments on a book by John Roberts, the noted economist from Stanford, who won an Economist Best Book Award in 2004. And then I'll conclude with Hudson Bay Company and more specifically Sir George Simpson's attitude towards social responsibility. In the beginning, there was the Hudson's Bay Company. In the fur trade, they sometimes say, what does HBC stand for? And the word is here before Christ. It was a trading monopoly granted by King Charles II to the Company of Adventurers in 1670, indeed on May 3rd, so we were just a few days after his birthday. The grant was called Rupert's Land after the king's cousin, Prince Rupert of the Rhine. Now, I want to give you a sense of the magnitude of it. 3.9 million square kilometers. You can see it in relationship to Europe, and it was 12% larger than the Louisiana Purchase. The company had sole authority to administrate law and disperse justice in the region, quite a large region to cover. Now, Thomas Douglas, 5th Earl of Selkirk, plays a crucial role in the story. As a youth, he had visited the Highlands. He saw the clearances firsthand. It made a huge impact on him. They led him to develop theories of emigration. In the early 19th century, he developed two colonies in British North America, one the larger and more successful on the east coast in Prince Edward Island, another one much less successful here in what is now Ontario, then called Upper Canada. But he also had read Sir Alexander Mackenzie's account of his trip to the west coast overland in 1793, the first person ever to cross from one coast to the other. And in that story of his epic voyage, Mackenzie described the fertile lands of the Red River Basin where present-day Winnipeg is. In 1807, Selkirk married Jean Wedderburn, and it gained him two powerful relatives Andrew Wedderburn, later Colville, and cousin-in-law John Halkett. When Selkirk and his in-laws started buying stock in the Hudson Bay Company, the shares were down sharply. No dividends had been paid as a consequence of the trade barriers between Britain and France as a result of the Napoleonic Wars. And if I could have a slight digression here, one of the things I encountered in my research was two solitudes, not the way most Canadians think of two solitudes of French-English, but the solitudes between Canadian historians and British historians. The Canadian historians, many of them, don't look beyond the border of Canada, across the ocean to Britain, and asking, I don't mean to be unkind to you, but I know you're not British, but you're sort of representing Britain here. I couldn't believe it when you said, oh, the one company I don't have on my list is the Hudson Bay Company. And I thought, boy, isn't that typical of a British attitude to Canada. Within 6 months, his brother-in-law, Colville, was on the governing committee of the Hudson Bay Company. So, in 1811, agreements were signed by Selkirk and the Hudson Bay Company, granting him 116,000 square miles for 10 shillings. Robert, I hope you see how far that grant went. Maybe we could drive up to it next April. The grant was 5 times the size of Scotland. In return, Selkirk was to establish an agricultural settlement, and I don't think this is well enough known. The first English-speaking settlement west of the 95th meridian in North America, 300 miles west of St. Louis. This was a crucial decision, and I'm sure most of you, not all of you, because some of you are pretty young, will remember the great stage play Oklahoma, where it said the cowboy and the farmer can't be friends. Well, here we're going to get into an example how the fur trader and the farmer can't be friends. Many, even within the Hudson Bay Company, opposed settlement, although some saw it as important as provisioning for the trips west. But the Northwest Company, the rival fur trade company, saw it as a plot because it sat astride their supply lines. And so the red line is basically the Northwestern Company's supply route. The Bay was coming much further north, and Astor's company was to the south. And so you've got this land grant right across their supply route. And at the same time, the Hudson Bay Company had decided they would enter the Athabasca territory. And if you want an idea of where Athabasca, it's up at the top left, and that's north of where the fires are currently in Fort McMurray. So the settlement exacerbated relationships between the two countries, and the settlers came in. By the fall of 1814, there were over 200 residents at Red River, and the company, the governor, antagonized the local Métis by first issuing a pemmican embargo, and the Northwest Company were already having supply problems because the Americans had just captured Detroit in the War of 1812, and then banning the buffalo hunt. So they decided to retaliate, and they went in and drove half of the colonists off, gave them passage to Upper Canada. The winter of 1815-16, the Bay entered Athabasca, and the Northwesters, this was a very competitive system, introduced what they called the starving system, and 16 Hudson Bay Company traders starved to death. More settlers were coming in, back up to 200, and on June 19th, 1816, the bicentennial next month, 60 mounted Nor'westers crossing north of the settlement at the forks of the Red and the Assiniboine rivers, and the governor, Semple, went out with a group of Orkney farmers to meet them. What followed wasn't pretty. 21 farmers were killed, 10% of the settler population, and 1 Nor'wester. Initially, many of the farmers were only wounded. Only a third of them were killed in the first round of shooting. But once after that, they were murdered, their bodies were mutilated, and left to the prairie animals. a tragic event, an unintended consequence of an act of philanthropy and social responsibility. And the next 5 years escalated into a period of open warfare between the two companies. I mean, I think the general image of Canada is the peaceable kingdom. Certainly when the Mounties went west, we had a pretty peaceful time. But the first 2 decades of the 20th century was a period of fierce and violent, well, it was just brutal. I gave a somewhat similar paper 25 years ago, and one of the critics said, well, why is he talking so much about violence? The reason was because there was a lot of violence. August of 1816, Lord Selkirk, this is just one example. Lord Selkirk, to begin retaliation, sorry, that's a picture of the battle. It really wasn't much of a battle. The Métis forces were extraordinarily well trained, and on horseback, the settlers were not well trained for warfare. This is a picture of Fort William, which was the main inland post of the Northwest Company. In August of the following year, Lord Selkirk went there, and if you're going to, that's pretty formidable, eh? So what he did is he hired 100 Swiss mercenaries. So they weren't fooling around, and he captured that. He captured McGilvery, the leader of the company. That was obviously a terrific blow for the Nor'westers. There were ongoing legal and media battles, and this, as a result of this robbery, kidnapping, outright warfare, brought both companies to the verge of bankruptcy. Now, the Northwest Company was a partnership of partnerships with a 20-year renewal clause. Representatives of the wintering partners who lived out here went to London to negotiate with the Bay. Colville worried that the Nor'westers were too strong, but when he saw the division between the wintering partners from Fort William and the agency partners in Montreal, he realized he could cut a deal, which he did, and they came to an agreement. The Northwest Company actually got more than 50% of the shares, which some people say was a victory, but as one wintering partner expressed it, amalgamation. This is not amalgamation. This is submersion. We are drowned men. So what happened after the merger? The government confirmed and enriched the company's trading monopoly and administrative legal role. All Canadian operations were consolidated in York Factory. There you go. How'd you like to move there from Montreal? You may not think Montreal's a pleasure. And this place was closed, and a lot of you wouldn't think that was a great place to be, but it was a lot better than Norway House, I'm telling you. So that's what happened. Ship from Montreal dropped from 2/3 of the total to 10%. George Simpson, later Sir George, Colville's protege, had arrived on the scene from the London counting house. And by the way, speaking of Sir George Simpson, my colleague Allison has a co-author who's not going to be here, Gary Sprackman, and he's at York University. He's done an absolutely extraordinary book entitled Management Accounting at the Hudson's Bay Company from Quill Pen to Digitization, based on weeks, if not months, of research on the wonderful archives of the Hudson Bay Company, which are now owned by the people of Manitoba. And I've actually recommended to people who have never been to Winnipeg, you should go and see the archives. Simpson's ruthless combination of post-merger trade confirmed that the Hudson Bay Company had won the peace, if not the war. Now, this is a slight digression, what my wife would call a Joe Martin logic leap. But I was just starting to begin the business history program here in 2004, and I was excited to learn of a brand new book called The Modern Firm by the distinguished economist John Roberts from Stanford. This is the way it was described in the blurb. It was to develop powerful conceptual frameworks for analyzing the interrelationships between organizational design features, competitive strategy, and the business environment. And it talked about using historical examples. And what was the historical example they chose? Hudson Bay Company and Northwest Company, and I knew a fair bit about that. And I read that book, and I was really disappointed. I shouldn't say I still haven't got past the first chapter, and I've had the book for 12 years. But between pages 4 and 8, there are at least 10 errors, and the simple example was totally misrepresenting the Bay's profitability in its first century of its existence. But that is not all. In discussing organizational development, now why an economist would be discussing organizational development is beyond me. He neglects the fundamental weakness of a partnership in a stable or declining market. I was a member of the original management committee of the Canadian Partnership of Touche-Ross, and I know the strengths and weaknesses of partnership. But so did Easterbrook and Aitken from the University of Toronto 60 years ago. That is, the absence of share capital and the practice of distributing profits annually. That's no way to win a long-term battle. So I thought I should take a practitioner's approach and present an analysis to you. My partner, Sandy Aird, who you'll meet this evening, and I worked for a firm called P.S. Ross & Partners, and our managing partner was called Jerry Fish. In 1964, he wrote a book called Organization for Profit. Let me take you back to the early 60s. Chandler's book had just come out in Strategy and Structure, and what Jerry did was take the structural component and divided it up. And he said there is the structure on the organization chart, there are people within the boxes, and he's writing in the early 60s, there is the spirit of the enterprise, which you would all recognize today as culture. Peters and Waterman some years later made a lot of money because they were more alliterative than Jerry, and they used structure, staff, and shared values. But that was the model that Sandy and I used in consulting for many times, looking at those three elements. And then Sandy came up with an external element as well for doing an analysis, which considered public policy, customers, and competition. So I'm quickly going to go through that in terms of what was happening. Now, yesterday, Mike Wagner began this process, and by the way, Mike, I have your notes if you need them. But as you recall, there was the 7 Years' War, or as the Americans like to say, the French-Indian Wars, and they ended in 1763, and then there was the Quebec Act of 1774, and those are the appropriate boundaries which we should have today in Canada, in North America, to see how far south Quebec goes. South of the Great Lakes. And then, sorry? And then in 1783, of course, after the American Revolution, there's a second Treaty of Paris. And the boundary changes. Well, I just think if you're a fur trader in Montreal, what does that do to your access to the south of the Great Lakes? And then Pitt's government, in their wisdom, passes a constitutional act, and you have Upper and Lower Canada. So those poor fur traders who used to have easy access, all of a sudden they're cut off from the U.S. and they've got a political barrier between Ontario and Quebec. And this got worse because Jay's Treaty confirmed all this, and the Brits had to start withdrawing from the western posts like Michilimackinac. And then over in Europe, and we'll get to this later, there's the Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. And of course in 1812-14, what happened? The Nor'westers fought for the British cause, kicked the Americans out of the western posts, and the Brits gave it all back to the Americans. So that sort of typical treatment of Canada by both the Americans and Brits. I'm not trying to be provocative or anything. Now I want to move to the customers. Now don't be confused. I have to do this with my students. When they think of beaver, this is their image. But point of fact, that wasn't what they were selling. Beaver hats were the height of fashion. And so a number of the early Canadian scholars ignored customers in the Canadian market and blamed the Hudson's Bay Company's suspension of dividends from 1809 to 1815 on Northwest Company competition. But the real issue was in Europe. For some reason, Professor Roberts in his book calls he keeps talking about customers, but he's really talking about suppliers. Now, why an economist wouldn't know the difference between a customer and a supplier is beyond my comprehension, but the customers were clearly in Europe. And the Hudson Bay Company had, because of the nature of their charter, to sell their furs there. They didn't have the option the Northwest Company had of going to the U.S. or China, and so that market disappeared with the French Napoleonic Wars. And there you'll see the boundaries. There were orders in council issued in the United Kingdom. There are Napoleonic decrees on the continent. And I couldn't find a lot of data on fur sales, but I did find general sales. And sales to the German states and Holland disappeared during the wars. And, of course, they dried up to the U.S. during the 1812 war. So for a significant period of time, the European market was destroyed and sales reduced. So turning to the competition, in terms of timeline, the key thing is that there are a number of timelines, but 1812 to after a period of relative quiet, a period of quiet competition, it moved into outright competition, and then 1816 warfare. So the Hudson Bay Company had a cost advantage because of the route through the bay to the northwest was shorter. Both companies were spending a lot of money. They established 600 posts. Many were only occupied for a few years, and the animal stocks were declining. There was extreme violence, including starvation. And unlike in Revenant, this was not white man against red man, but, and Sam, I hope you don't get too upset, two of the most violent tribes ever, both white, both from the Highlands of Scotland, barely removed from a primitive and savage society, both good haters and good fighters. So from the beginning, the Hudson Bay Company was given the rights to make civil and criminal laws for their territories, but did not really exercise the right before the early 1820s. The stockholders were wealthy and the charter was as rock, but in the late teens they suffered huge losses, and let's look at how they were able to survive. Structurally, they were a royal chartered company in contrast to the Northwest Company partnerships, and I can't make that point too strongly. They had top-down decision-making, which permitted greater flexibility in terms of lower-down structures, staff, and spirit of the enterprise. They adjusted their personnel and compensation policies. They started hiring different kinds of people. They increased their staff while the Northwest Company was consolidating. They went from the quiet Orkneymen to Highland Scots, more people from Rupert's Land, as well as former Nor'westers, which they could recruit because the Nor'westers were coming down, and they gave incentive policies. But if Hudson Bay Company's spirit of the enterprise had not become more aggressive, they would not have succeeded. By 1815, it was clear that they were no longer sleeping by the bay. The new spirit was mandated from the top in London. It is evident that no success can be expected until you're able to expel force by force. And the new militancy led to clashes, high prices, lavish distribution of liquor, intimidation of Indians, and on several occasions the use of force to confiscate the furs and trade goods of the opposition. So, in conclusion, Lord Selkirk was a well-meaning man with a philanthropic spirit and a strong sense of social responsibility. He planted the first English-speaking agricultural settlement west of the 95th meridian. The settlement lay across the supply lines of the Northwest Company and resulted in the massacre of Seven Oaks, an unintended negative consequence of corporate social responsibility. The massacre in turn led to the merger of the two companies. Well, economist John Roberts' 2004 book won him an Economist Award, which makes you wonder about The Economist as well. It is full of historical errors and misses the fundamental structural problem of a partnership battling a corporation, especially at a time of contraction. I hope that I provided you with a rational and historically accurate analysis of Hudson Bay Company's success. That portrait, for those who are not aware, is Sir George Simpson. After the Bay clearly had social responsibilities, but after the merger, their focus was much more on profitability. The Imperial Parliament, which actually, when they eventually became aware of all this violence, became concerned, passed the Fur Trade Regulation Act, which called for a new and expensive judicial system to regulate the trade based in Canada, working alongside company tribunals, which might eventually displace Hudson Bay Company tribunals. The company reacted immediately with a new council for Rupert's Land, a new council for Assiniboia, where the Selkirk settlement was. They authorized the new governors and councils to administer justice. They empowered the governors to enroll males in an armed force for defense and protection. And Lord Bathurst, Secretary for the Colonies, acceded to all of their suggestions. Simpson became Governor of Canada, a role he played for nearly 40 years, and is deservedly in the Canadian Business Hall of Fame, one of the most astonishing Canadian CEOs of all time. However, while the Hudson Bay Company provided Rupert's Land with government, Simpson focused on profitability, not social responsibility, and dare I say, creating more bastards like himself dans la façon de le payer. Thank you.